I am firmly convinced, and I don't think I could ever be made to believe otherwise, that my wife is maybe the most patient woman on God's green earth. And I feel that way because she is married to me, and, well, I can be a bit much sometimes. I have this thing about my brain, and I don't know what it is, but whenever I'm thinking about something, or I'm planning something, or I'm trying to figure out what's next or stuff like that, some of that stuff that's in my brain just sort of leaks out. Like, I don't know what it is, I need to hear it come out of my mouth before I can ever move forward with it. And for my wife, oftentimes this always happens at the worst times for her. It always happens like when she's finally sat down for the day and maybe she's just taken a moment to breathe and decompress and scroll through Instagram and just kind of relax a little bit. And while she's in the midst of that, I'll just turn and fire off something weird like, hey, you think that thing that I make, if I did this particular support beam, would that work out well for that? She has no idea what's going on in my brain, and so she's just kind of learned to respond in those moments, sure. Whatever you say, dear. Or if, like right now, we're planning on a family vacation and all this stuff, and I'll just have these thoughts in my brain. It's like, hey, do you think I need to ask Jennifer, our travel agent, should I ask her this particular question about this particular thing that nobody cares about on their vacation, but it just popped in my mind, so do you think I ought to do this? And this is right as my wife is opening up her book to finally be able to read at the end of the day and just kind of have a moment to herself, and sure, ask her. She has to about every 10 to 15 minutes, it's like these thoughts just leak out of my mind. And it's not always just, things that are mildly sarcastic that I feel like she needs to know about. It's just things that, I just think about. I plan a lot in my head, and those thoughts just sort of leak out. My wife has to be the one who gets there. And that's why I'm betting, at least I've never asked her this, maybe this is a weird time for me to do that, but I'm betting that my wife's absolute favorite thing is when I've stopped planning a particular project. When I've stopped planning putting whatever it is together around the house, or stopped planning about this particular sermon, or I've stopped planning about this particular woodworking project, and I actually get started on it. Because she knows that whenever that moment comes, that she's going to have at least a few hours where I'm going to leave her alone. She knows, especially when I'm doing a woodworking project, that I might be out in our garage for so long. I'll get so wrapped up in what it is that I'm working on, and so wrapped up in the prepping the wood and cutting it and doing all this other stuff that I'll forget to do silly little things like eat or go to bed at a decent hour. Or get my phone charger. But she'll have all of that time to herself to finally just do whatever it was that I kept interrupting during that course of time. My favorite part of any project is always when you finally get started on it. When the planning of it is done, when you've got it all mapped out, when you've got it all in your head or on paper, and I need it on paper because I forget what's in my head sometimes. And I finally get to put saw to wood. Once that metal hits that wood and sawdust is flying everywhere, I feel alive. Because the thing that I've been thinking about for so long and planning is finally being made into a reality. I've moved on from coming up with all the different angles and weird things that Mandy doesn't care about, but I ask her about anyway. And I'm finally ready to bring it to life. It's exciting for me. It's a great moment. And again, I will lose hours to it because I get so wrapped up and so excited about what's happening that I can't wait to make this happen. And I'm feeling that right now, to be honest with you, because there's a project that I'm actually getting ready to start. I've been thinking about this particular one since Christmas. And I've been driving my wife nuts about it since Christmas. But I've had a couple of projects for other people ahead of it. I have this weird philosophy in my brain that if you're going to pay me money, your project gets put ahead of mine. It's weird. But now I'm finally ready to get started on this one particular project, and so I'm getting amped up about it. In fact, there's a part of me that's kind of like when church is over and I've had my lunch, I'm in the garage. Let's go. Because it's an exciting time for me. It's that excitement of seeing this thing become a reality and become part of it. But while I'm certain Mandy loves when I start a project, because again, she has all that time to herself to, do silly little things like finally fold the laundry without being interrupted by it, or, do all the things that she likes to do, like read her book. She finally finished a book last night that she'd been working on for months that I kept interrupting her on. talking about the project that I'm about to start. She loves having that time to herself because it's uninterrupted, but she knows that there's going to come a certain point. That there's going to come a moment during the course of me working on this project where I'm going to text her from the garage. I'm going to say, hey babe, you need to come check this out. I don't know why I do this. Because inevitably, like, all it is it's just what I've worked up to that certain point. Very rarely do you finish a project as soon as you start it. Like, that never happens. And so she'll come out into the garage, she'll humor her husband yet again, and she'll see the start of whatever it is. And there's a problem with that, and that's that she doesn't understand what's going on in my brain. I'm already thinking about what it's going to look like. I'm thinking about what the finished project is going to look like when it's all finished and it's all completed, and I'm so excited about this. But to my wife, she just walks in and it's just stuff. She might see a framework of something, but she doesn't know what this is. She's not nearly as excited about it as I am. She's not nearly as proud about where I'm at in the project as I am in that particular moment. The only time Mandy might care is if I'm working with a different type of wood. Like if I'm working with a Shadua or if I'm working with Purple Heart. Mandy might come in and go, wow, that looks really cool, because it's a different grain pattern than what she's used to. Or maybe she's just wowed about the fact that there's a specific breed of wood that naturally is purple. It's really cool, by the way. It's purple too, so yeah. So she might go, wow, and then she doesn't care anymore. But for me, I'm so excited because I know where this is going. I know that while this doesn't look like much right now, I know what the finished product is going to be like. And so I get excited about that, but Mandy doesn't really share in that excitement with me because she doesn't understand what's going on. It may be underwhelming for her. It may even be somewhat disappointing because I'll be really hyped up about it. And she'll expect it to be much further along than what it actually is. But for me, it's the most exciting part. It's a unique feeling, to say the least, when you finally move on to the point where you are finally getting underway on whatever project it is that you are working on. If you own a home, you know what this is like. When you've been thinking about remodeling that kitchen, maybe since the day you moved in. Or when you're finally going to get that new shower put into your bathroom that's going to have like all kinds of fancy jets and different settings on it that's going to make your shower much more luxurious. You finally have gathered all the resources, all the funds that you think you're going to need. You've got the contractor lined up, he's ready to go, and finally that day comes, he's getting started. That project is underway. There's an excitement about that. You've planned it, you've dreamt about it, you've seen the need for it, but now you're finally ready to get going on it. It's exciting. I don't know that there is a more fun stage than when the project is getting started. But as fun as that is, whenever we're talking about a rebuild, or a refinish, or yes, even a reconstruction, it can also be the most intimidating part. You've seen the need for this reconstruction, you've understood like this has to happen. You've reached a point where you're finally ready to do it. That desire is within you to make it happen. And you have spent so much time planning this because you know that this particular thing that needs to be rebuilt or reconstructed, that this is important. This matters. Maybe it has significant value to you. Maybe it matters to somebody in your life. But now it's time. It's time to start sanding away that old finish. It's time to maybe start replacing that one part of it. Maybe it's time to take the whole thing apart. And there's an intimidating factor to that, of knowing that I'm getting ready to start this. And if I don't do it right, or if the person who's working on this does not do it right, then the whole thing could be ruined. And maybe it's not going to be what it ever was. Maybe it's not going to be as amazing as it had been 20, 30, however many years ago. So there's a fear that's involved in that. There's a worry that if you're in the midst of a reconstruction, things might get awesome, but in a reconstruction, it might be difficult. Because when you get finished, it may not be the same. It might be different than what it was beforehand. And if you can remember what it used to be at its heyday, reconstructions can even cause mixed emotions for you. And in fact, that's exactly where the Israelites were when we get to our text today. We're going to find ourselves in Ezra chapter 3. We're going to be back in Ezra today. We're going to be in Ezra chapter 3, verses 8 through 13. So please go ahead and turn there in your Bibles or open it up to your app. And again, maybe you're still not overly familiar with Ezra because again, it's not a place that we preach on very often. In fact, actually this week I was talking with Mandy about this, and I told her that up until I was preparing for this particular sermon series, I don't know that I'd ever heard a sermon in Ezra before. I've listened to a couple just to kind of get an idea of how to approach this particular text, but before that, I don't think in my entire life, and I've been in church since I was a small child, I don't know that I'd ever heard a Sunday school lesson about Ezra. I don't know that I'd ever heard a sermon about it. I don't know that I'd ever heard anybody even mention the name of Ezra unless they said you need to memorize all books of the Bible. So Ezra is kind of a difficult place for us to find, but again, like we said last week, there's so much that's going on in this book that I think speaks to where we are today. And if you recall from last week, we talked about how the Israelites had finally reached this particular point. For 70 years, they had been in Babylon. They'd been in a foreign land, taken away from there because of their idol worship. God allowed a foreign entity to come in and remove them. They burned down the temple of God. They destroyed the vast majority of what was once a great city in Jerusalem. And after 70 years in captivity, King Cyrus of Persia, he allowed the Israelites to start coming back. While they were in captivity, they began to see signs of a spiritual awakening and a recommitment and a reconstruction taking place in their people. And we see elements of that through people like Daniel and like Daniel's friends, because we see a young group of people who are recommitted and refocused and working on reconstructing their own faith, having a hunger and a desire for more and more of God. And so when King Cyrus allows them to go back to Jerusalem, he doesn't just tell them, you can go back home. He tells them, you can go back home and you can rebuild the temple. You can rebuild the place where you as a people come to gather and worship your God. This is an exciting time for all of them. They finally get a chance to do this. They felt the need for it. They felt, as we talked about last week, a supernatural desire from God to see this temple rebuilt. Now all they got left to do is just plan it before they're ready to finally build this thing back up. But when you're talking about reconstructing something as significant as, I don't know, a temple, you want to make sure that you plan it really well. And so for the people who were in charge of this reconstruction, in charge of this rebuilding, they wanted to make sure that they had plenty of time to think about this. In the first part of Ezra, chapter 3, verse 8, it tells us exactly how long they spent preparing and planning for this rebuild. It says there, in the second month of the second year after they'd arrived at God's house in Jerusalem. Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Yeshua, son of Jozadak, and the rest of their brothers, including the priests, the Levites, and all who had returned from Jerusalem from captivity, began to build. 2 years and 2 months. 2 years of being back in Jerusalem. And now finally they're ready. This project has been on their minds since before they ever came back. Again, King Cyrus himself decreed, go and rebuild the temple. So they've been thinking about this for a good long while. And 2 years they had to plan and prep and make sure that everything was ready and all of their ideas were thought out and planned out. 2 years is a long time, isn't it? Like I said, I've been thinking about this particular project since Christmas. That's one of the longest times I've ever spent thinking about a project. These guys waited 2 years. Understand, that's 2 years for people who are outside of the planning of just anticipation. And that anticipation at a certain point is going to start turning towards impatience. Right? If you're out and about and you see some of the people who are involved with the planning, you're probably going to pull them aside and say, hey man, are we ever going to get this thing going or what? Is this ever going to finally take place? We've been talking about this and talking about this and talking about this. When are we going to do it? If you're part of the people who are planning, though, there is a constant push and pull. You're being pulled from these people who want to see this temple built, who want to see the temple of God rebuilt, who want a place to come and worship together. But you also recognize the enormity of the project. You know how significant this is going to be. You know the desire to not get it wrong. To make sure that you have thought about and planned for every instance that could possibly happen. So for 2 years and 2 months, they planned. If you go back to the specifications of the original temple that Solomon built, the expectations of this temple had to be high. And so they wanted to make sure they took their time planning it. So it's understandable that after 2 years and 2 months of planning and preparing, that the people would finally be absolutely thrilled to hear that we are finally ready to get started. There's an anticipation that's in the air. There's an electricity that's going on. The people can't wait for this moment. When we finally get to the rest of verse 8 and on into verse 9, it says, they appointed the Levites who were 20 years old or more to supervise the work of the Lord's house. Yeshua and his sons and brothers, Camildel, I know I mispronounced that, but that's fine. With his sons and the sons of Judah and Henadad, with their sons and brothers, the Levites joined together to supervise those working on the house of God. Now, if you are anything like me, you looked at that list and thought, boy, we got a lot of bosses, don't we? We got a lot of supervisors going on here. But again, understand the significance of what this is. For 70 years, these people spent in captivity. 70 years removed from the land that they had. And during the course of that 70-year period, they began to experience a spiritual renewal and recommitment and revival like the Israelites had never experienced before. When they came back, they spent 2 years planning this thing. We're at nearly a quarter of a century since the temple was destroyed, or 3/4 of a century since the temple was destroyed. This is a big project. And so the idea of doing a temple, this is not like building a house where you can get a couple of guys together and get most of it figured out and planned out. This is the temple of God. This is the place where people are going to come worship, not just for this generation, but for generations to come. There's a lot that goes into this, and so you need to have certain people who are in charge of certain sections of it. And those supervisors need to all be on the same page. Because they have to have a clear picture. If I'm going to build this particular part of the temple, I know exactly what it's going to look like. And I'm going to be able to clearly communicate that to everybody else that's around me. One guy is not going to have time to go from place to place and say, well, this has got to be that way, and that's got to be this way, and oh, no, that's not quite level. You need to level that back out. Or, oh, man, you use cypress trees, we want a mahogany. You can't have that. You have to have people who are in charge of certain areas and certain places because they need to be on the same page. And we get the impression that not only were these guys on the same page, but there is so much excitement in the air for what's going on in Jerusalem. Again, 72 years without a temple, without a place for them to come together as a people to worship together. 72 years without a spot to call their spiritual home. And so whenever they just get the most basic of things finished, there is a huge reaction that takes place. There's huge emotion and huge ideas. There's a reaction at the slightest bit of development, and man, did they know how to celebrate it. Verses 10 and 11 show us the kind of reaction the people had at this particular moment. When the builders had laid the foundation of the Lord's temple. That's it, just the foundation. That's all. That's all we've got accomplished. That's maybe a couple of days' work. When they laid the foundation of the Lord's temple, the priests, dressed in their robes and holding trumpets, the Levites descended from Asphah holding cymbals, took their positions to praise the Lord, as King David of Israel had instructed. They sang with praise and thanksgiving to the Lord, for he is good. His faithful love to Israel endures forever. And then all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord because the foundation of the Lord's house had been laid. We are just at the foundation. There's no walls. There's no structure. Just the base is done. And these people are so excited about what God has been doing, about the way that the Spirit of God has been moving within them for 72 years now, that finally we've laid down the foundation of the Lord's temple. We're going to worship. Woo! When's the last time you ever thought about a foundation? I'm going to guess that every building you've ever gone into, you don't think about the foundation unless there's something wrong with it. Right? And yet just at the foundational level of finally getting to this point where we've been planning for all this time and now we've laid the foundation, let's sing about how great God is. For he is good. His faithful love to Israel endures forever. We can't wait to sing the praises of God. Can you imagine how exciting that worship service would have been? The emotion, the fire, the passion of their singing about how great God is. This is a huge moment for them. There are people in tears simply because of a foundation being laid. Because now finally we're getting closer to seeing this vision that we've had for 2 years about what God's temple is going to be like, and we're finally going to have a spot that we can all come in together and we can all worship together as one big family and sing about how great our God is. And so how can we not praise just the foundation of it? Everybody there is so excited about what God is doing amongst his people. Well, okay, not everyone. Not everyone is excited about this. Verse 12 indicates that there were some people who gathered at this worship service who weren't nearly as excited about what the rest of the people were excited about. It says, but many of the older priests, Levites, and family heads who had seen the first temple wept loudly when they saw the foundation of this temple. But many others shouted joyfully. Weeping is not usually something that takes place when you're feeling really good. Weeping is something that you do when you are grieving, when you're troubled by what's going on here. And I got to be honest with you, as I'm looking at this scene and I'm seeing this passion and this excitement that's going on all around them, I don't understand how anybody can be sad right now. I don't understand how anybody can be seeing this incredible worship service taking place all around them and weep. These guys are in the midst of a spiritual rebuild, not just a reconstruction of a temple. A temple is nice. A temple is a building, though. It's wood and mortar and brick. Great. And yet these guys are weeping in the midst of a spiritual revival taking place all around them as people are so excited at the prospect of just having a foundation of a place to come and worship. Yeah, I mean, for 2 years they've had an altar. It's not like they've not done anything. It's not like they haven't worshiped in 2 years, but all they've had is an altar. And for 2 years they've been waiting for a sign that we're finally getting somewhere. And now we are, and everybody's really excited, except for these guys. Why? Why in the world are you upset right now? Well, Ezra only gives us one indication. He only says one thing as to why these people would be weeping so loudly and why they'd be so down in the dumps while everybody else around them is singing so joyfully. It's right there in the middle there. After it lists off who it is, it says, who had seen the first temple. These guys are old enough that they saw what the original Temple of Solomon looked like. They remembered what it had been. And now even just at the foundation, they know that this one's going to be different. And they're upset by that. They're upset at the notion that things are going to be a little bit different. Notice I didn't say worse. It's going to be different. And that thought has them so down in the dumps that they cannot participate in the joy and the excitement and the celebration and the worship that is taking place around them. Everybody else there is having maybe one of the best worship experiences of their lives. But these guys are upset because they can tell that this is going to be different. Because it's not going to be like how they remember it. Nothing will dampen the joy that is found in the midst of a reconstruction quite like this. We have a tendency as human beings to constantly long for the things of the past. We like to remember things the way they used to be. We look back fondly on all the things that happened, and yeah, maybe in some cases it is true that the way things were better. But that doesn't mean that it should stop our joy and our excitement for what's happening now. It oftentimes causes us to miss out on some very huge, good things that are taking place all around us. For these priests, these Levites, for these other family heads, they were missing out on the joy of the worship that was taking place all around them. Because they couldn't move past on the way the temple had been, but could never be again. Understand that temple beforehand, it was nice. Again, I challenge you, go back and look at the things that Solomon did. I'll remind you, Solomon was about as rich gets. Like Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, whatever the name of the dude is who owns the Clippers, I can't remember his name. They were paupers compared to Solomon. Solomon was worth $2 trillion. I believe that's bigger than our national debt. $2 trillion. So naturally, when Solomon was king and he's making his temple, he's going to make it as great as he can because he can afford to. We're in a whole different economic system at this point in time. That temple has been burned to the ground. It's gone. It's not coming back. And so, yeah, that temple may have been more spectacular than what this is going to be, but they're not excited about what the temple is going to look like. They're excited about having a place to come and worship. But these guys are longing for something they can't get back. There's a word that we use for looking back fondly on things of our past. It's called nostalgia. Nostalgia can be an incredibly powerful force in our lives. We look back at different things in the past and we remember them oh so fondly. Nostalgia is the reason why the Andy Griffith Show still gets great ratings. I'm not kidding. Like there was literally people who will put the Andy Griffith Show on before a show they really want you to watch because they know you'll watch Andy Griffith. Nostalgia is the reason why 50s and 60s diners are so popular in different tourist destinations. Because you'll be able to go back and get yourself a malt shake like you did when you were a teenager. You know what? I'm going to have to throw myself in the midst of this because while I was writing this, I was surrounded by Batman and Power Rangers memorabilia. Because nostalgia is pretty significant in my own life as well. Nostalgia in and of itself is not a bad thing. Like, please don't hear me say that. There's nothing wrong with having nostalgic feelings. But the problem comes in when our nostalgia becomes so powerful in our lives, and we want so badly to go back to the way things were, that we miss out on all the things that God is doing right now. That we overlook and miss the things that God is at work at right now, here today. We cannot let nostalgia blind us to what God is doing. We cannot long so much for the way things were that we miss out on what's going on right now. That we forget to worship and praise and shout about all the greatness of our God, for he is good and his love endures forever. Nostalgia is not a bad thing, but it can become a stumbling block to our reconstruction. Nostalgia can dampen the joy of what God is doing here and now. Nothing can cause the fire of a reconstruction and a revival to die out quite as much as continually longing for the way things used to be in the church. Let me remind you of something that you already know. We can't go back. The cruelty of time is that it continues to pass. And so as much as we might long for the way things used to be, it's not coming back. We don't get to come back around. There is a reason why the windshield is so much larger than the rearview mirror. We can't let our nostalgia for a time that has passed dampen the joy of the reconstruction that God is doing in his people right now. Last week I pointed out several different things that I have seen going on, and yet still I've had conversations with Christians just this week. Oh man, everything is terrible. Not like it used to be. But you're missing out on what's going on around you. You're missing out on the joy and the celebration and the worship that is taking place in lives that have been recommitted and reconnected and revived and reconstructed. Because you're too busy focused on what it used to be. There's nothing wrong with being nostalgic, so long as it doesn't get in the way of you seeing the joy of what God is doing now. Because here's the thing about God, God doesn't stop. Right? Do we believe that? Do we believe the Holy Spirit of God just one day decided, I'm done? Took place somewhere in the mid-90s. No, the Holy Spirit of God continues to move in our midst. It continues to work and change and correct and help build up and help change new lives. And we're missing out on the joy of that because we're longing for the way things used to be. And here's the thing about it all is, the weeping and the longing for the temple of old, it didn't accomplish anything. Here's what verse 13 says. It says, the people could not distinguish the sound of the joyful shouting from that of the weeping because the people were shouting so loudly. And that sound was heard far away. I am so grateful that the weeping of these guys longing for the temple of old didn't stop these people from worshiping so loudly that they drowned them out. And I believe that when we connect with the excitement of what is going on around us, when we see what the Holy Spirit of God is doing here and now, instead of spending our time wondering, why can't it be like it was? That our praise and our worship is going to drown out those who are. God is doing incredible things in our midst. I believe he's doing incredible things in this world. And you heard me say it last week, and you're going to hear me say it again. I'm so tired of whiny Christians. Whining about a time that we can't get back. God is doing incredible things in our midst, and we're going to be far better suited if we actually stop and look around and maybe join in on that praise. Reconstruction can't hang on nostalgia. Don't let your nostalgia rob you of your joy of what God is doing right now. In fact, and I found this last week, like this was a part of our Sunday school class, and it made a connection in my brain that ever since then I can't stop thinking about. These guys are weeping and mourning because of the loss of the temple of Solomon. Right? Solomon's the one who built that temple. These guys would have been really wise to have listened to the words of Solomon when he wrote in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 10, and we're going to close with it. Solomon himself wrote, "Do not say, why were the former days better than these? Since it is not wise of you to ask this."